Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 351. And on this episode of the podcast, I'm talking about Pete Alonso going back to the New York Mets. The New York Mets got the big prize of the offseason, outfielder Juan Soto. But after that, there was the question of whether or not they were going to bring back slugging first baseman Pete Alonso. And we finally have an answer. Alonso is back on a 2-year, $54 million deal with an opt-out after the first season. Let's talk about why Pete Alonso is a beloved member of the New York Mets. His 226 career home runs are third all-time in team history. The 53 he hit in 2019 is the most in a single season by a rookie ever in the sport. Alonso has at least 3 separate seasons where he hit at least 40 home runs. No other Met has had more than one, and his 586 RBIs is 6th all-time in franchise history. Also, what's happened with this specific player and the fan base is bigger than the stats. He's become a beloved figure. He's got a nickname, the Polar Bear. There's a lot of players in baseball who are the best players on the team, but not all of them are fan favorites, which he has been up until now. I would argue he has been replaced first by Francisco Lindor and now again by Juan Soto. From a logistical standpoint, you can look at Pete Alonso and say he's not the player he was early on. Last season, he did lead the team with 34 home runs, but he only drove in 88 and was third on the team. So for the average baseball fan, it's like, what's the big deal with this guy? But for Mets fans, he still holds a special place. And don't get me wrong, he's still a very good player. He can mash the ball. However, there was a time where he was close to Aaron Judge as an equal almost, and now that's not the case. Judge is a 2-time MVP and already viewed as an all-time great, while Alonso is a very good player who very few consider great. The thing that he's got going against him is he's so one-dimensional, and for a player to be viewed as special, he at least has to hit that 40 home run plateau. And yes, I get it. The counter argument would be only 23 players in the majors last year hit at least 30. It's still a rarity to hit 30 home runs, but we don't worship 30 home run hitters. We worship guys who hit 40 to 45 or even hit that 50. Those are the special seasons. So when Pete Alonso has a 30 home run season, we do not view it as special or unique. And clearly, neither did the Mets. Because if they did, they would have given him that long-term contract he was clearly wanting. What not enough people are talking about when it comes to Alonso not breaking the bank on this deal is if he was a free agent after last season, he would have gotten that big deal he was looking for. In 2023, he was coming off of a season where he hit 46 home runs. Free agency in baseball is coming down to what you do during that walk year. Aaron Judge hit 62 home runs. The New York Yankees pay to keep him. Juan Soto has a great season with the Yanks, hits the home run that sends them to the World Series, and the Mets, by some standards, overpay. Baseball has become a what have you done for me lately business. We used to pay guys for their legacy. We used to pay guys for what they have been, but now baseball is paying you for what you are doing in the sport right now. If this was 2008, I do believe Pete Alonso would have gotten a bigger deal from another team. He would have gotten exactly what he wanted because he would be viewed as a rarity. They would look at the back of his baseball card and say, yes, this guy mashes home runs. But now teams are looking at what you did during that walk year. And if you have a huge walk year, they're going to give you that huge contract. I also just don't buy this idea that some baseball experts are selling that we no longer value the first base position. Like, that's just simply not the case. I believe that if Pete Alonso had a 50 home run, 120 RBI season, he would have gotten the contract that he demanded, but he did not have a special season. This contract isn't great because the season he's coming off of wasn't great either. Alonso, by his standards, had an okay season, so guess what he got? An okay deal. The New York Mets are the clear victors of this negotiation. They get to keep one of their franchise stars at a reasonable price in the biggest reason they had all that leverage is because Alonso is no longer the sole face of the team. They now have Francisco Lindor, Juan Soto, and Mark Vientos. If Pete Alonso was the sole star, then I believe the Mets would have given him $170 million if that's the contract he was looking for, because they would be a team desperate for star power. But they don't need his star power. They don't need his signature name. They have Lindor, not only the face of the franchise, but an MVP candidate, and now Juan Soto, who you think is going to dominate the sport for the next decade, and Mark Vientos, a young player who a lot of people were talking about replacing Alonso at first base. Pete Alonso for the New York Mets became more of a luxury than a necessity, and that did him no favors during this negotiation, because the New York Mets realized that Pete Alonso needs the New York Mets more than the New York Mets need Pete Alonso. Because if the Mets had lost Pete Alonso but still won a ton of baseball games next season, everyone would have gotten over it. But Pete Alonso might go to a new team and start to struggle with that team. I mean, we don't know what would have happened with Pete Alonso. The backup options just didn't seem great to me. I mean, the Detroit Tigers would have been a great fit, but his power in Comerica might not translate. The Toronto Blue Jays feel like an uninspiring choice. You have to think that Pete Alonso cares about his legacy with the New York Mets. He wants to be remembered as one of the best players in franchise history. I mean, there's a really good chance that in the next season, Alonso is going to become the all-time home run leader in Mets franchise history. That's a big deal for a player like Pete Alonso. I always say this about players going to a second team. You are starting with a fresh start. You are not a beloved figure. You're not the same Pete Alonso you were with the New York Mets. It's going to be about the results. Staying with the Mets means you're staying with the fan base that cares about you as a player. A fan base that remembered that just last season you hit a clutch home run off of Milwaukee closer Devin Williams, helping the Mets make it all the way to the NLCS. Those kinds of things matter when you stay with one organization for your entire career. And maybe this doesn't mean that Pete Alonso is going to stay with the Mets for his entire career, but it makes sense for me anyways for him to stay with this team as long as humanly possible. The team brilliantly played the idea that they wanted Alonso back and put all the pressure on him. Here's what Mets owner Steve Cohen said during FanFest about working with Alonso and his agent Scott Boras to get a deal. Quote, "This has been an exhausting conversation and negotiations. Soto was tough. This is worse. A lot of it is we've made a significant offer. I don't like the structures that are presented back to us. I think it's highly asymmetric against us, and I feel strongly about it." End quote. What Cohen did there was make Alonso the villain. If he leaves the Mets, it's on him, not us. Even the biggest Mets fan, Pete Alonso fan, knows right now he's not worth $200 million. With this deal, Pete Alonso gets to stay with the team in the short term in hopes of having a huge season and getting a better deal. The reality is, I don't foresee Alonso ever getting a super long-term deal. He's the ultimate free-year deal kind of player. I don't think a 5-year deal will ever be on the table again for this specific player. I feel that way, but I could be proven wrong, because again, if he has a 50 home run season next year, opts out of his deal, he's going to get a way better contract. I just don't know how much of a long-term commitment any kind of team wants to make towards Pete Alonso. I get what I'm about to say is a very old school statement, but how much does a team really want to pay a guy who's a career 249 hitter? I like these guys too. I like Kyle Schwarber, who are home run or nothing kind of guy, but there is a level where I'm willing to go pay-wise. Like, I would give Pete Alonso $100 million. I'd give him $120 million, but anything more than that is a bit too much for my taste, and the Mets clearly agree with me. They value him at this level. Even if he does have a 50 home run season, I don't see this Mets organization ever giving Pete Alonso the long-term commitment he wants from them. When it comes to these things, I like to be on the side of the players. Like, you're rooting for the players because it's money and it's an organization, but I agree with what the Mets have done with Pete Alonso. I think they have fairly evaluated what they should be giving this player and what he's worth to this team right now. But I also get the counter argument of, oh look, you just gave Juan Soto $700 million. What's another $150 for Pete Alonso? I mean, what's the big deal here? But I get it. It's a business. Steve Cohen doesn't want to give that kind of money to anyone. And maybe Steve Cohen just doesn't feel that way about Alonso that Mets fans do. I feel like, yes, they're bringing Pete Alonso back to appease the fan base, but I'm not sure that Cohen and the Mets want a long-term relationship with this player. There's a part of me that thinks if this works out and Pete Alonso has a great season next year, he's going to opt out, and the Mets are not going to be in the running for giving him that long-term contract, that it would be another team making that deal with Alonso. I got the feeling that the team thinks that Pete Alonso overvalues himself as a player, and that's a lot of baseball players that you can say that about. We have gotten to a situation where 30 home runs does not mean you get a record-breaking contract any longer. I mean, Anthony Santander got 5 years, $92 million. What, Teoscar Hernandez got a 3-year, $66 million deal from the Dodgers? I mean, those are nice deals for those players, but those are the kinds of players that Pete Alonso was last season. He wasn't Juan Soto. He wasn't Aaron Judge. He wasn't Bryce Harper. He wasn't Manny Machado. And I would argue that Teoscar Hernandez and Anthony Santander had better seasons than Pete Alonso had. They had better walk years, and they got the same kind of deal that Pete Alonso got. So it makes sense on every level from a New York Mets standpoint. They should not have overpaid for this player. Not every team this offseason has brought back their own stars. The Houston Astros just lost Alex Bregman to the Boston Red Sox, and it's hard to say which team is making the right choice. The Mets keeping Alonso, the Astros not paying Bregman. Only time will tell, but the winner in the short term is the Mets because they get to please their fan base, while Astro fans cannot be pleased by them losing their all-star third baseman. I would argue and will that Bregman is on another level than Alonso because he's won actual World Series titles with the Houston Astros, but Mets fans do care about the player Pete Alonso. I mean, I've been there with my team. When I watch a player and I fall in love with his game, I want my team to do everything to re-sign him. I remember when the Red Sox lost Jacoby Ellsbury to the New York Yankees, I was devastated because Jacoby Ellsbury had won 2 World Series titles with the Red Sox. He was one of the fastest players on the team. He was just a fun guy to watch play the sport of baseball, but ultimately, the Red Sox were right in letting Jacoby Ellsbury go. He did not live up to that contract whatsoever. Bregman made the Astros choice easy by getting over $40 million a year by the Boston Red Sox. In the case of the Mets with Alonso, this is a reasonable contract for a slugging power hitter. And yeah, I like Pete Alonso's chances of having a decent season next year. I mean, he's going to be playing alongside Vientos, Soto, and Lindor, so you'd think he's going to be able to put up power numbers and drive in more runs. But if he opts out next season, he's going to be 31 years old. Who is going to give Pete Alonso, a 31-year-old, a 6 or 7 year contract? That's not going to happen, and I don't like his chances of getting a 5-year deal anytime soon either. I do think it's kind of crazy that Mets fans would have been angry if they lost Pete Alonso. I mean, your team did just go out there and spend over $700 million on one singular player who you all think is 1,000 times better than Pete Alonso. I understand getting sentimental about a player, but your team just had one of the best off seasons because they got the best player on the market. It's hard to be angry with the Mets if they had decided to go in another direction. I mean, they also brought back Sean Manaea and added starting pitching with Frankie Montas and Clay Holmes. These shorter term deals with these opt-outs are becoming more and more common because we all know, what is Pete Alonso going to look like when he's 35 years old? Not very good. So why would I want to pay Pete Alonso when he is 35 years old? I mean, baseball teams are finally waking up, and the only reason we are shocked by it because we all grew up watching baseball players get overpaid well into their 40s. And the only guys getting these kind of mega deals anymore are the Juan Sotos and Shohei Ohtanis of the world, the top players in the sport, which unfortunately Pete Alonso is not amongst them. And one more time for the first baseman don't get paid anymore crowd, call me next off season when Vladimir Guerrero Jr. breaks bank. And that's for a couple of things. He's a lot younger than Pete Alonso, and he's more of a star than Pete Alonso. I think Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is going to have a great season, and he's going to get upwards of $400 million. The other thing that I do want to talk about is not enough teams were interested in Pete Alonso for him to get a better contract from the New York Mets, and that is a frustrating thing about the sport of baseball. It's like not another team could have used a power bat. Like, look at the Seattle Mariners. You have Julio Rodriguez, you have all of that pitching, and you don't need Pete Alonso to score more runs. Like, you couldn't have given Pete Alonso a nice 4-year, $80 million deal or something like that. Like, you couldn't even compete for his services. That's kind of embarrassing. The Cincinnati Reds would have made a ton of sense. I mean, you have your star infielder in Elly De La Cruz. I mean, pair him with a power bat like Pete Alonso, and now you're talking. Like, I feel bad for these teams that they can't compete with the likes of the LA Dodgers, but then when the price comes down, that's when you need to pounce. That's when you need to take advantage and go get a player like Pete Alonso, because Pete Alonso was clearly out there for the taking. I mean, you could have stolen him from the New York Mets if you had given him a little bit more money than they did. Those teams I mentioned could have used Pete Alonso even more than the Mets. I mean, that's what's crazy about the situation is the Mets no longer need Pete Alonso. They have other options. They have other star players. They were going to score runs with or without Pete Alonso. Maybe they'll score more with him. That's to be determined, but there's so many teams out there that could have used a power bat. The San Francisco Giants, yes, you had a good offseason. You brought in a star shortstop in Willy Adames, but couldn't you have used a power bat like Pete Alonso? And I get it. Maybe he wouldn't have been able to bring his signature power to that ballpark, but give it a chance. I mean, make a significant offer. Be in on the player. That's my big issue, is not enough teams were in on this player. I don't think he's a great player, but he's a very good player who's very good at what he does, which is hit home runs. I like the situation where Alonso is because he's going to be motivated to have a better walk year than he had last year. I mean, he's going to be surrounded by more talent. Juan Soto is on that team now. Teams are going to pitch to Pete Alonso. I would expect him to have a 40-plus home run season. That's what he needs to have in order to get that longer-term deal that he aspires to get. This is just an opinion, but if you're dreaming of him ending his career as a lifetime New York Met, I think that dream is going to die. Like, I think this is a short-term fix. I don't think the New York Mets want to give Pete Alonso any more money than they've given him right now. Like, this just doesn't feel like a marriage that's going to last in the long term. This is a short-term fix. They are in win-now mode. They think it's best for their team to have Pete Alonso right now, but they are not going to pay him long-term just to keep him as one of the signature faces of the franchise. And as cold as that sounds, I think it's the right strategy. They need Pete Alonso right now because they don't have a better option at first base. Yes, Mark Vientos could move to third base, but then you don't have a great option at third. Pete Alonso is right for this Mets team right now because they are in win-now mode. But long-term, he may not be the right answer at the position, and the Mets know that, and that's why the short-term deal makes sense sense for both sides. Some were speculating that what Pete Alonso was after at the beginning of the offseason was the 9-year, $214 million deal that first baseman Prince Fielder signed with the Tigers in 2012. Scott Boras has denied that, but either way, the problem with that thinking is it's no longer 2012. Teams are no longer paying players for what they have done. It's what they think they will do in the future. Prince Fielder was a great player before that contract. He was not a great player after that contract, and that's why teams are weary of signing Pete Alonso long term.